Marcus Ellison, a black veteran, was dragged in chains right inside the courtroom by the very cops sworn to protect the law. Humiliated before the judge and jury, his only crime was standing tall against injustice. But when Officer Cole declared his official arrest in front of everyone, the room turned into a battlefield of power and prejudice. And just as Marcus seemed abandoned, the doors burst open and FBI agents stormed the courtroom, turning silence into shock. What happened next would change everything. If this moment shook you, hit like and share this story with others. Now let's step into what really happened that day. I was there when they brought Marcus Ellison into the courtroom. He wasn't shackled at the ankles, but the story was already written on his wrists, shallow red grooves where the cuffs had been. He walked slow, not because he was weak, but because every step felt like a test. He's a black man in his 50s, a veteran, the kind you picture folding a flag with steady hands. That morning he wore a plain, well-used suit. The jacket hung a little loose across the shoulders. The crease in his pants was sharp. His shoes were polished to a quiet shine. It looked like he'd done all he could to meet the court with dignity, and the court met him with suspicion. The bailiff told him where to stand. The bench lightened and dimmed as clouds slid across the skylight. You could hear the hum of the air conditioner and the tiny click of pens when the jurors shifted. Nobody said guilty, not yet. They didn't have to. You could see it traveling along the rows, tight mouths, lifted chins, the kind of silence that makes a man shorter. A couple of people in the gallery leaned forward to get a longer look at him, like he was an exhibit. One juror, third from the end, crossed his arms and stared into the middle distance the way people do when they've made up their minds. The charge was resisting and obstructing that catch-all box they tick when the night gets messy and the report has to make sense. It came from a minor run-in outside a storefront, a disagreement that should have ended with everybody going home. Instead, it turned into this: a veteran standing in front of a judge wearing the best clothes he owned, trying not to let the room take something from him he couldn't get back. Marcus kept his head up, not proud for show, just steady. He glanced toward the flag behind the bench, one of those quick, reflexive glances soldiers never completely unlearn. Then he looked over the jurors like he was trying to read the weather. His eyes weren't pleading. They were measuring. He had the look of a man who has walked through enough dust and noise to know when to speak and when to hold his breath. Officer Bradley Cole sat on the state's side, hands, folded jaw, set uniform perfect. He didn't smirk. He didn't need to. His certainty filled the space around him. Behind him, another officer, Kruger, kept shifting his weight and watching the gallery, daring anyone to react. The prosecutor wore a navy suit the color of caution tape in the shade. He kept his voice flat and confident, almost bored, like this was all routine. Judge Karen Whitmore took the bench glasses low on her nose, a woman who had probably seen 1,000 mornings like this, and told herself the system evens out if you just let it work. She gave the room a polite nod, then looked down at the file. It was thin. That didn't mean anything. Thin files can still cut. When the clerk read Marcus's name and the charge, a small sound rose from somewhere behind me, a quick inhale swallowed at once. Marcus didn't turn. He kept his eyes front shoulders level. I wondered if anybody in that room knew his service record, if anyone knew what he'd done or what he'd carried home. No medals on his chest today. Just the ghost of a cuff and the quiet of a man trying to be heard without raising his voice. The prosecutor laid out the story like he was spreading a picnic blanket, simple, clean nothing to snag on. Mr. Ellison refused a lawful command. He obstructed. He created a disturbance. He paused after each phrase to let the words settle, then moved on. No body cam footage was ready. No neutral witness. Just the report and the uniform, and for a lot of folks, that's enough. Marcus didn't flinch. He rolled his shoulders once, barely, like a man loosening a knot in his back. He glanced at his court-appointed lawyer, who nodded without looking up from a legal pad as blank as the moon. The nod didn't promise anything. I remember thinking the room had its own gravity. Everything fell the same direction, toward a decision that was already waiting. The old clock on the back wall ticked loud enough to feel like it could be heard on the recording. A woman 2 rows ahead of me, silver hair, church dress, folded her hands and whispered something to herself, a small prayer that no one would own but her. When Marcus finally spoke, it wasn't to argue. He said, "Yes, Your Honor, and I understand, and I'll wait." The way he formed those words made the small hairs on my arm stand up. He sounded like a man who had been trained to follow a chain of command. and was now standing under a chain of doubt. There was a moment, only a moment, when he lifted his eyes and the light caught them. For a breath, I saw the soldier, the uniform once framed. Not a hero the way movies sell it, just a man who held the line when it was his turn. Then the light shifted, and we were back where we started, the room heavy with other people's conclusions. The jurors watched him the way people watch a storm slide across the county map, detached, curious, a little entertained by the colors. Someone coughed. Someone else clicked a pen until the bailiff looked their way and the clicking stopped. In the corner, a young woman with dark hair, Elena, though I didn't know her name, then kept her hands folded on her purse and stared down at them like she was negotiating with fear. What I remember most is the feeling that the floor was tilted. Facts would roll to one side if you didn't set your feet wide and brace. Marcus braced by standing as straight as he could. He didn't throw blame around the room. He didn't explain his whole life. He did the simplest, hardest thing. He met their eyes one by one, as if to say, I am here. See me as I am. It should have meant something. It didn't, not yet. Judge Whitmore cleared her throat. The prosecutor rechecked his notes. Officer Cole shifted so the badge on his chest caught the light. Marcus's lawyer finally raised his head and whispered, We'll speak when it's our turn. Marcus nodded slow, like a man on a long road who knows the next mile is uphill. And that was the start of it, the day a veteran walked into a courtroom with polished shoes and cuff marks on his wrists, and the room decided what kind of story this would be before a single piece of real evidence hit the table. You could feel it in your bones. This wasn't a search for truth. It was a performance with predictable beats. I tell you this because I was there close enough to hear the soft leather of his shoes against the floor and the dry scrape of paper sliding under the judge's hand. Close enough to see that when Marcus lifted his chin, it wasn't defiance. It was a last careful attempt at dignity in a place where dignity goes to be tested. I remember the exact moment Judge Karen Whitmore took the bench. The room rose, the bailiff intoned, and for a heartbeat the ceremony almost felt like protection. Then the judge settled her glasses low on her nose, flipped open a thin case file, and the air changed. The set of her mouth said, Let's move this along. It wasn't cruelty, more like impatience that had learned how to sit up straight. You could feel it roll through the room the way heat rolls off a road. The prosecutor stood, navy suit, crisp tie, a pencil that never seemed to dull. He read the charge like he was reading a traffic report, clear, unbothered, already convinced. Resisting, obstructing, disorderly conduct. Each word got its own square floor. No body cam today, he said, still being processed. No neutral witness, the bystanders dispersed. What he did have, and he made sure to say it twice, was sworn officer testimony. He glanced toward the defense table as if to ask, Do we really need more? Down in the front row, Officer Bradley Cole looked like a recruitment poster, all pressed lines and squared shoulders. He didn't grin. Not outright. His satisfaction worked quieter than that. It sat in the way he leaned back and the tiny nod he gave the prosecutor, as if to say, Go on. When the judge asked if he'd be testifying, he answered, Yes, Your Honor, with a voice that carried authority the way a badge carries light. 2 seats over, Officer Kruger scanned the gallery as if trouble might sprout from a cough. His eyes slid over us and stopped on Marcus like a thumb on a bruise. He tapped one knuckle on his knee, an old habit or a countdown he kept to himself. The jurors' 12 ordinary faces thrown together by a summons arranged themselves into opinions. I could see it in their posture. A woman with a careful bun folded her hands and stared at the prosecutor like he was reading from the book. A man in a sport coat kept his chin tilted up, eyes half-lidded, as if watching over the top of glasses he didn't wear. One juror squinted at Marcus with something like curiosity, the kind of person saves for a museum placard. A couple of folks in the gallery, older white men in weekend blazers, nodded along with the charges, the way you nod to a song you've heard 1,000 times and never question the words. Judge Whitmore turned a page, skimmed, and sighed so softly it might have been a draft from the vent. Proceed, she said, and the word sounded like a gavel all by itself. At the defense table, Marcus's court-appointed attorney made a show of flipping his legal pad, but the pages were startlingly clean. He had a good face for sympathy, soft eyes, gentle jaw, but his pen didn't keep up with the moment. When Marcus leaned a fraction toward him, the lawyer whispered something that tried to be reassuring and landed as placeholder noise. He didn't object when the prosecutor wrapped all the missing pieces in one neat phrase based on the officer's observations. He didn't ask for a continuance. He didn't ask for the footage. He didn't ask. It's strange how a room can agree without saying so. The judge's small impatience matched the prosecutor's ease. The prosecutor's ease matched Cole's certainty. Cole's certainty reached out and touched the jurors one by one until their faces took on the same quiet, settled look. It felt like watching water find its level, and the only thing standing above that level by a hair by stubborn spine was Marcus. He knew it. You could tell by the way he tightened his hand around the edge of his chair, not enough to creak the wood, just enough to keep from floating away. He kept his chin at a measured height, not defiant, not bowed. When the prosecutor said Mr. Ellison refused a lawful command, Marcus's eyes flicked to the flag behind the bench, and then back quick as a blink he wouldn't let anyone own. Officer Cole, the prosecutor, said, "We'll call you first," and Cole's "yes, sir" arrived like a promise. He smoothed an invisible wrinkle from his sleeve. For a split second, he let his gaze rest on Marcus, then on Judge Whitmore, then on the jury box, as if connecting the dots on a picture already drawn. From where I sat, the judge looked like a person who wants to believe the machine she supervises is still capable of mercy. But what she had in front of her was a file that didn't argue, and a routine that had run long, and the comfortable gravity of a story told by men in uniform. She didn't tilt the table. She didn't have to. All she did was let it keep tilting itself. The prosecutor kept things tidy. He spoke about scene control, escalation, non-compliance. He used each term like a cushion between himself and the raw shape of what happened. Every time he said non-compliance, the juror with the sport coat gave the smallest nod. To agreement or to rhythm, I couldn't tell. There's a particular quiet that settles when people have chosen their lane. You hear the paper breathe. You hear the ventilation whisper. You hear the tiny, stubborn sounds of life that keep going even when a man's life is being reduced to a paragraph. Somewhere behind me, a churchwoman murmured a verse I didn't know by heart. On the aisle, a security guard adjusted his belt and stared at his shoes. The room held steady, all shoulders facing forward, like a congregation waiting for communion. Marcus sat in that quiet and didn't chase it away with explanations. He squared his shoulders, and the soldier he used to be stepped back into him for a moment, just enough to hold his gaze steady. He wasn't playing for sympathy. He was refusing to surrender the one thing the room could not take without his help, dignity. Judge Whitmore lifted her eyes from the file and looked at Marcus over the rims of her glasses. Something passed there, hesitation maybe, or a thought that had nowhere to land. She cleared her throat. "We will hear from Officer Cole," she said, and I heard a faint apology tucked behind the formality, the way you sometimes hear rain behind a closed window. If you'd asked me then what the truth weighed, I would have said less than a report, less than a badge, less than the tired convenience of a story people already believe. Marcus must have known that too. He kept his fingers flat on the chair, counted his breaths, and stared straight ahead while the room arranged itself against him. That's how bias looks up close. Not a shout, not a slur, 1,000 small angles that all lean the same way. And a man sitting still in the middle of them, trying not to slide. The prosecutor's voice carried steady clipped, like he'd rehearsed the words 100 times before he ever said them in that courtroom. He painted Marcus as if he were some wild figure tearing through the night, hostile, dangerous, combative against lawful officers disturbing the peace of the community. Each phrase landed heavier than it deserved, and I could almost see the picture he wanted the jury to hold a black veteran, not as a man who served, but as a threat that needed containing. Marcus shifted in his seat. He had been sitting still, jaw-locked, eyes forward, but now he couldn't. He pushed himself up slowly, hands gripping the edge of the table. His voice came rough, but steady enough to cut through the room. "That's not what happened. That was as far as he got." Judge Whitmore snapped her head up, glasses flashing under the light. "You'll have your turn, Mr. Ellison," she said, her tone clipped final, the kind of voice that closes a door. For a second, the silence was louder than the accusation. Then from the state's table, Officer Cole leaned back, lips curling into that smirk I'd already grown to hate. It wasn't a broad grin, it was small, sly, the kind of smile that says, "This is my stage. I've already written the ending." His eyes slid toward Marcus with something darker than confidence. It was ownership, as if Marcus's fate was already sealed in the ink of his report. The air inside that courtroom thickened. You could feel it pressing down heavy as a storm before it breaks. Somewhere in the gallery, a woman whispered, "He looks calm. How could he attack anyone?" Her voice barely carried, but it was real human. That's when Kruger, the second officer, shifted in his chair and turned his head just enough for the gallery to notice. He didn't have to speak. The sharpness of his glare was warning enough. The whisper died as quickly as it had risen, swallowed by fear. I remember the way the jurors reacted. Some leaned back, arms crossed, letting the prosecutor's words settle into their bones like fact. Others sat stiff, eyes darting between Marcus and Cole, as if measuring who to believe, but none of them spoke. None of them shifted the balance. Their silence weighed heavier than the prosecutor's words. The prosecutor kept on layering phrases, building his wall of authority. This defendant resisted a lawful order. He endangered the officers present. His actions created a disturbance that threatened public order. He spoke like each sentence was a nail hammered down without pause, meant to keep Marcus pinned. Marcus sat back down slowly, shoulders squared, chest rising with a controlled breath. His eyes flicked toward the jury, then back to the judge, steady now, but lit with the sting of being silenced. That was the part that struck me most, not the outburst, not even the objection he couldn't finish, but the way he swallowed it down, held it as though discipline was the only weapon he had left. But the damage was done. The room had heard him try to speak, and they had seen him cut off. They had seen Cole smirk, had felt the unspoken power in the officer's stares. And now what lingered in the air wasn't justice, it was theater. The gallery sat in stiff rows, everyone playing their role. The silent jurors, the watchful officers, the restless prosecutor, the weary judge. And Marcus at the center, the man they wanted to turn into a villain, sat bound by rules that seemed to apply only to him. That's when I realized this wasn't about finding truth. It was about keeping order, and order written by the people already holding the badges and the gavel. And the rest of us could feel it, an unease crawling up our spines, the kind that tells you a verdict has already been decided long before the trial ever began. The room had stopped breathing. Justice wasn't in session. It was being suffocated right in front of us. I can still hear how quiet the room was right before it broke. Marcus rose slow but sure, one palm braced on the table, the other smoothing the front of his worn jacket, as if to press the wrinkles from the day. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't beg. He lifted his chin and said evenly, "I serve this country." He never reached the period. Officer Bradley Cole was already on his feet, chair legs scraping hard enough to spark. "He's disrupting the court," Cole barked, voice booming against the marble. Then, with the confidence of a man who expected no contradiction, "This man is under arrest." Everything jumped at once. Officer Kruger surged forward, two more uniforms, flanking him like a drill they'd practiced. Hands grabbed Marcus's wrists, wrenched them back. His shoulder dipped, his knee bumped the chair leg, and he was shoved down, pinned to the wood he just stood from. I heard the breath rush from him, more surprise than pain, and then the sound that froze the room, the sharp metallic clack of cuffs closing. That sound didn't belong in a courtroom. It belonged to parking lots at midnight, narrow hallways lit by buzzing bulbs, the kind of places where nobody is watching. But here it rang out under the crest and the flag and the seal behind the bench. Heads snapped up. A juror flinched so hard her pen fell and rolled under her chair. Kruger pressed Marcus's forearms together and leaned his weight in, face blank with practiced effort. "Stop resisting," he said, though Marcus wasn't moving. The other two officers spread their stance, elbows out, making a wall of uniforms between the gallery and the man on the chair. Somewhere behind me, a chair leg skittered, then a voice thin and breaking. "Lord, this ain't justice." It came from a woman in a church dress, gray hair pinned neat, her hands clutched so tight the knuckles went white. She wept without wiping her eyes, as if even that small mercy would be counted against us. Judge Karen Whitmore jolted forward in her seat. "Officer Cole," she began the title, catching in her mouth like a splinter. Cole turned his head just enough for her to see what everyone else already felt, the certainty in him, the permission he carried like a weapon. The judge's gavel tapped once, tentative. "Order," she said, but it was a wish, not a command. Cole didn't look back at Marcus when he announced, for the record and for the room, "The defendant is under arrest for disrupting these proceedings." He angled his body toward the jury, toward the transcript, toward the idea that if you say a thing with enough posture, it becomes true. The prosecutor didn't object. He straightened his papers as if a plan had landed exactly on time. Marcus didn't thrash. He didn't plead. He sat under the weight of 3 men in a system and chose the only ground he had left. He drew a breath that had to fight its way past somebody else's hands and kept his eyes level, not with Cole, but with the flag behind the bench. One quick glance, then back to the middle distance, where a man can rest his gaze without surrendering it. The gallery found its voice in pieces. A low murmur swelled and thinned the sound of people choosing between fear and outrage. 2 pews over a man said he wasn't even, and cut himself off when Kruger's partner lifted his chin in warning. The bailiff took a half step forward and then stopped, waiting for a cue that never came. I looked at the jurors. Some stared straight ahead, faces evacuated of expression, the way people look at car wrecks they can't help driving past. One juror's lips moved soundlessly, counting perhaps or praying. Another had that fixed, polite smile you wear at funerals when you don't know where to put your hands. Officer Cole, the judge, tried again, softer now, as if the volume of her voice might coax the day back into the rules. Cole gave her a small, respectful nod that said nothing would change, least of all because she asked. The gavel touched wood once more, a token gesture that did not disturb the dust. Kruger clicked the second cuff shut and tugged, testing the fit, as if cinching a strap on a bag. The metal kissed bone. Marcus flinched, then stilled. "Formal arrest," Cole announced. "Defendant is non-compliant and disruptive." The words skated across the surface of what we all saw. It was the language of reports, neat phrases that never bled. I remember feeling the room tilt, that quiet, sick angle when power stops pretending. A veteran had tried to finish a sentence about service, and for that he was pushed down and bound within sight of the scales. The symbolism wasn't subtle, but it didn't have to be. It was effective. The churchwoman's shoulders shook. Someone else whispered, "No, no," like a small engine refusing to turn. A younger woman on the aisle, dark hair, hands white at the knuckles around her purse, stared at her lap, breathing shallow as if building courage atom by atom. Marcus lifted his head as far as the hands allowed and met the jury's eyes one by one. He didn't ask them for anything. He just made sure they saw him, the man under the badges, the man with the polished shoes and the cuff marks and a sentence cut in half. That was when I understood how a system can humiliate a person without ever raising its voice. The judge's hesitation, the prosecutor's tidy silence, the officer's rehearsed efficiency, all of it braided into a single message. This is how it's going to be. And the worst part wasn't the metal or the barked commands or the way the words "under arrest" echoed against stone. The worst part was the ease, the way it happened, like a reflex, as natural and thoughtless as a blink. The way the room let it, because rooms like this learn to. Marcus sat hunched in the defendant's chair, his wrists bound tightly in cold steel. The cuffs weren't just restraints, they were insults, reminders pressed into his skin that no matter who he had been in this room, he was only a man in chains. His eyes lowered, heavy and tired, the proud soldier now folded inward, like someone who had been left with no ground to stand on. The murmur of the courtroom dimmed around him, as if all sound had retreated, leaving him alone in the center of the storm. You could see it in his face. He was no longer staring at the bench or the jury. His gaze had turned inward. His breathing slowed, and for a moment his eyes clouded over, not with tears, but with memories too sharp to keep out. He was back in a place far from this sterile hall of justice. Back on the battlefield where dust clung to his skin and the air carried the sting of smoke. He saw comrades fall beside him, heard the thud of helmets hitting the dirt, smelled iron in the wind. He remembered the way soldiers gritted their teeth as they lifted bodies onto stretchers, and the hollow silence after the medevac flew away. And then the funerals. The flag folded into triangles handed to mothers and widows with words that never covered the ache. He saw coffins lined up, draped in red, white, and blue, and he remembered saluting until his arms shook because it was the only honor he could still give. Those nights on the front line, bitter cold gnawing through his jacket, came flooding back. He had fought with every fiber for an idea bigger than himself. Freedom, dignity, a promise that this country would not forget its own. Now here he sat cuffed in a courtroom, accused of being the very thing he had risked his life to defend others against. The thought wrapped around his chest like barbed wire. His lips moved in a whisper that trembled in the stillness. I fought for freedom. But where is mine? It wasn't shouted. It wasn't meant for the judge or the jury or even the officers. It was meant for himself, a question only a man who had given everything could dare to ask. The words seemed to dissolve in the stale air before they could reach anyone else, but I heard them. And I will never forget. For a moment it looked as though Marcus had surrendered. His shoulders dropped further, his hands hung limp in the cuffs, and his chin sank low. The idea of fighting back seemed to vanish from his body. He looked like a man who had accepted that the verdict was already written, that his life would be reduced to a headline no one would question. Watching him then felt like watching a flame flicker its last, shrinking smaller with every gust of indifference around it. But then from the gallery, a voice cut through the silence, not loud, not defiant, but steady enough to carry. An older black veteran, his hair silver at the temples, shook his head and leaned toward the man beside him. His words, though whispered, seemed to echo. That man doesn't deserve this. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't meant for the whole room. But it carried a weight no prosecutor could match. The voice of someone who had walked in the same boots, carried the same burdens, and understood what it meant to wear service on your skin only to be betrayed by the soil you defended. Marcus's head lifted just slightly. His eyes shifted, almost uncertain, as though he wasn't sure he had heard right. But he had. You could see the recognition spark in his expression. His lips pressed together, his chest rising, just a little fuller than before. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was resistance to despair. A reminder that he wasn't invisible, that at least one soul in that room still saw him for who he was. The people around me felt it too. A couple of heads turned toward the older veteran, and though most quickly looked away, embarrassed or fearful of drawing the officer's stares, something had cracked the silence. A woman in the back row nodded faintly as if agreeing, but not daring to speak aloud. Another juror, young and restless, tapped his pen nervously against the pad, betraying that the image painted by the prosecutor didn't quite sit right anymore. Cole noticed. His jaw tightened, his smirk faltered for the first time, and he shifted in his chair like a man reminded that silence can be fragile, and fragile things can break at the worst times. Marcus sat straighter now, not defiant, not triumphant, but steadier than a moment before. He had been on the verge of slipping into the abyss of resignation, but one quiet voice had thrown him a lifeline. A small, almost invisible moment, but in a room suffocating with bias, it mattered. The despair was still there. It wrapped around him like chains heavier than the ones on his wrists. But threaded through it was something else, faint and persistent, the knowledge that he wasn't completely abandoned. The soldier in him, the one who had learned to stand up again when the weight grew unbearable, stirred just enough to keep him upright. And that was how it ended this moment at the bottom of the pit. A man cuffed, broken by a system determined to erase him, sat on the edge of surrender. But a single whisper reminded him not everyone had turned away. And sometimes that was enough to keep a flame alive, waiting for the next breath of air to bring it back to life. That was when the air shifted quiet, almost invisible, but enough for me to feel it. While Marcus sat chained, the weight of the room pressing down on him, a young woman near the back straightened in her seat. Her name was Elena Ramirez, though most didn't know it yet. She was no lawyer, no official, just a Latin woman in her 20s. Hair pulled back tight, sitting with her purse tucked close. I watched her hand slip inside the purse, hesitate, then come back out holding a phone. Her fingers trembled, but not from clumsiness. It was fear and resolve wrestling inside her at the same time. She lifted the phone, angled it toward Marcus, and pressed record. For a moment, nobody noticed. The officers were too focused on keeping Marcus pinned in shame, and the prosecutor was already rehearsing his next line. But truth has a way of finding cracks, and Elena was one of them. She kept the phone low, half hidden by the pew, the red dot of the camera glowing like a spark in the dark. Then Kruger saw it. The officer had been scanning the crowd the way predators watch for weakness, and his eyes locked on her. He moved fast, his boots scuffing against the polished floor, his shadow falling across her row. His voice cut sharp and cold. "Turn it off or I'll arrest you too." The words hit like a slap. The gallery stiffened, breaths caught midair. A few people turned their heads as though bracing for the sight of another person dragged out in chains. But Elena didn't lower the phone. Her hands shook, yes, but she pressed it tighter against her chest as if daring him to take it from her by force. Her eyes darted up to meet Kruger's wide with fear, yet unblinking. There was terror there, but also something stronger, the stubbornness of someone who knew that once truth slipped away, it might never come back. For the first time since the cuffs snapped shut, Marcus lifted his eyes. He saw her, this stranger, holding her ground in front of a man trained to intimidate, and something lit inside him. His face didn't soften into a smile, but the dullness that had shadowed his eyes cracked open. He knew in that instant that the story wouldn't belong only to Cole's report. The truth was being captured. A murmur spread. A man whispered, not as quiet this time. He didn't fight back. They just dragged him. Another voice joined in. She's got it on camera. The words weren't shouted, but they carried bouncing from row to row. It was enough to make heads turn, enough to break the silence that had wrapped the courtroom like a shroud. Cole glanced back, irritation flashing across his face. He hissed something under his breath, too low to catch, but his smirk was gone. The neat order he thought he controlled was unraveling thread by thread, and it started with a girl who refused to press stop. The tension thickened. Kruger leaned closer to Elena, his voice low, venom dripping. Put it away, now! But her grip didn't loosen. Her knuckles whitened, and she shook her head, a tiny motion, but in that moment, it was louder than a scream. And Marcus, he sat straighter. Not free, not safe, but no longer invisible. His chest rose deeper, and his gaze steadied on the jury. For the first time, he didn't look like a man abandoned. He looked like a man witnessed. The gallery fed on that spark. You could hear the shift in their breathing, the whispered doubt spreading faster than the officers could glare them into silence. What began as one woman's trembling defiance became a quiet chorus, murmurs of protest, fragments of disbelief. This isn't right. Why's he in cuffs? She's filming good. It wasn't enough to topple the system, not yet. But in a room suffocated by bias, Elena's act was oxygen. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't stormed the aisle. She'd simply pressed record and refused to let intimidation erase it. And in doing so, she cracked the shell of fear that had sealed everyone else's mouths. I saw Marcus's fingers flex against the cuffs just once, as though the soldier in him had stirred. Not a victory, not even hope yet, but something closer, a reminder that the fight wasn't over. That sometimes even the smallest act of courage can tilt the balance in a room where truth is struggling to breathe. And that's how it began, the shift from despair to resistance. One trembling hand, one small phone, one refusal to bow. A spark that lit the first real glimmer of hope in a courtroom that had been drowning in silence. They started moving Marcus toward the side aisle, a slow, awkward shuffle with Kruger's hand clamped on his elbow and another officer crowding his shoulder. The gallery had found a fragile murmur after Elena lifted her phone, but you could feel the officers trying to press that sound back into silence. Cole fell in step beside Marcus, close enough to share breath. He bent his head, not much, just enough to make it seem private, then pitched his voice so the room would carry it. Men like you, from chains to crime, it's all the same. The words sliced the air clean. You could hear the cut and audible intake from the seats, the small, stunned sound people make when they witness something indecent and undeniable. A woman near the rail blurted, "Did he just say that?" Another voice, male, angry, started a curse and swallowed it whole. Even the old clock at the back seemed to hold its tick for a beat, as if the room itself refused to move past what it had heard. Marcus didn't answer. He didn't have an answer for that kind of poison. He closed his eyes and a single tear tracked down the line of his cheek, slow as a bead of oil. It wasn't fear. You could tell by the set of his jaw. It was the kind of pain that starts deep beneath the ribs, where memory lives and rises when someone takes your whole life and names it with a lie. A veteran who had folded flags for others, reduced to a slur that echoed off the wood and marble where justice was supposed to echo. Judge Whitmore's head snapped up. It was quick, instinctive, the way you look when something crosses a line you didn't draw, but know when it's been crossed. Her eyes found Cole. For a heartbeat, she wore a look I had not seen on her all morning, shock tinged with shame. Her lips parted. A gavel twitched in her hand. Then Cole shifted his shoulders slow and square, turning just enough to let his authority stand between her and the next word. The moment thinned. The judge glanced at the transcript clerk, at the prosecutor, anywhere. but at the insult hanging in the air, her mouth closed. The gavel touched wood with a timid tap that asked instead of ordered. The line stayed crossed. The gallery didn't forget. You could feel anger climb from row to row, a heat without sound at first, then a low quaking tone, people talking to themselves, because talking to the room might get them thrown out. A man in a ball cap muttered, "That's out of line." The churchwoman, the one who had prayed, pressed a hand to her chest and shook her head, tears bright and unblinking. The older black veteran who had spoken up earlier lifted his chin toward Marcus, a small salute. No one taught him to give the kind men invent when nothing official fits. Cole kept moving, satisfied lips settling back into that controlled half-smile. He had meant it to wound. He had meant it to claim the story back from Elena's lens and the murmurs gathering courage. He had meant it to remind the room whose language counted. Kruger heard the murmur rising and barked, "Keep moving," like volume alone could shove the rage back into our throats. But something had shifted. Words like that don't disappear. They stick. They cling to the wood and fabric and faces until everyone has to decide whether to wear them or wash them off. I watched the jurors. One blinked hard as if clearing grit. Another stared at the floor pen, caught motionless above a blank line. The young juror who'd been tapping earlier let his hand fall, the pen rolling silent into his lap. He looked at Marcus the way a person looks at a map they've trusted too long and finally sees the misprint. Marcus opened his eyes again. He didn't glare, didn't spit, didn't break. He simply breathed slow and deliberate, reclaiming one steady rise and fall from a world trying to shorten his air. The tear had dried into a faint salt line. He turned his head just enough to see Elena still holding the phone to her chest, and the older veteran still holding his posture like a post in the wind. A second breath came easier than the first. Judge Whitmore tried once more, softer than the room deserved. "Officer Cole," she said, the title brittle, the name careful. Cole didn't answer. He didn't need to. The message was already sent, and not just to Marcus. It was for the jury, for the transcript, for every bystander who might go home and tell the story using the wrong nouns. It said, "This is who he is. Believe me, not your eyes." The room answered anyway, in its own muted code, shift sighs, small declarations half swallowed. A woman whispered, "No," like a prayer and a refusal. A man behind me said I heard it to nobody in particular, like he needed to put the truth on record before truth got edited out. That moment didn't free Marcus. It didn't loosen the cuffs or untwist the narrative the prosecutor had nailed down. But it did something else. It made the cruelty visible. It made the bias audible. It took the quiet, suffocating prejudice that had floated through the morning and gave it shape, a shape ugly enough that even a cautious judge couldn't quite meet its eyes. Cole ushered Marcus toward the door, certain again, but a beat slower, as if he could feel the ground losing its smooth tilt. The gallery's simmer held. Elena's phone did not drop. The older veteran straightened another inch, and in the space between the insult and the door, the room learned the kind of lesson it never admits out loud once the mask slips. It's hard to pretend you didn't see the face beneath. We were still stuck in the same theater, the same script, the same heavy machinery of control. But under the roar of that machinery, another sound had begun, the sound of people deciding what they would and would not accept. It was faint, it was fragile, and it was moving toward the doors with Marcus ready to meet whatever came next. I swear the room was holding its breath when it happened. Marcus was almost at the threshold, Kruger steering him by the elbow, Cole pacing close like a man escorting his own version of the truth. The gallery sat tight as wire. Elena's phone stayed pressed to her chest. The older veteran stood just enough to make the bailiff glance his way. And then the courthouse doors, those heavy double slabs of oak, blew inwards so hard they slapped the stop pins and rattled the glass. The sound cracked across the chamber. Heads snapped. Even the judge flinched. They came in together, more than 8 of them, maybe 10 FBI agents in dark suits, shoulders squared in steps and cadence. The room felt smaller with them inside it, as if the air had weight and finally decided to drop. Their badges flashed once as they fanned just wide of the center aisle, boots thudding in a rhythm that didn't ask permission. Papers on the prosecutor's table ruffled in the backwash. The bailiff froze, hands half raised, unsure whether to block or salute. At the point of the formation was a tall man with iron gray at his temples. He didn't shout, but his voice carried like it knew exactly where to land. Release that man. He's under federal protection. The syllables didn't compete with anything else in the room. They owned it. Later I would learn his name, Special Agent Thomas Reed, but in that second the title felt less important than the authority and the way he stood. Everything stopped moving. Kruger's hand paused on Marcus's cuff. The prosecutor straightened without meaning to, as if pulled by a wire. A juror's pen clattered to the floor somewhere to my left and kept rolling until it tapped against a shoe and died there. Cole found his voice first, though it came out thinner than before. This is my courtroom. He meant my town, my officers, my report, my rules. He meant the usual gravity. Reed closed the distance in 4 clean steps and slapped a binder on the nearest table hard enough to bounce a legal pad. Not anymore, he said. We have evidence. He didn't turn to the judge for permission, didn't explain himself to the prosecutor. He looked at Cole like a man measuring hurricane shutters against a forecast he'd seen too many times. Cole opened his mouth then shut it again when 2 agents slid between him and Marcus with practiced ease. One agent said to Kruger, calm but shaped like steel, hands off. Another reached without hurry for the cuffs, the tiny key already between his fingers. The click that followed was the opposite of the earlier sound. It didn't clang. It released. It wasn't loud. It landed. Judge Whitmore stood. For the first time all morning, her voice found a firmer place to stand. Agents, identify yourselves for the record. Reed lifted his credentials, spoke his name and unit for the transcript, then angled his body so his shoulder touched the space between Marcus and the officers who'd been dragging him. It was a small repositioning with a large message the line had moved. How they had arrived then of all moments spread through the room in murmurs. I caught pieces of it from the agents' short-clipped exchanges, a hotline ping a flag on a live tip, an internal system that routes emergencies straight to a duty desk that never sleeps. Elena's video shaky frame-clear audio had gone out seconds earlier, uploaded on instinct to a number she had saved from a flyer after a community meeting. The signal traveled faster than the story unfolding on the floor. Somewhere in a federal office, someone watched those few raw clips, saw a veteran cuffed for insisting on a sentence, caught a slur inside the people's house, and made a decision. That decision wore shoes and arrived with badges. Elena's knees buckled into the pew as she realized what she'd set in motion. She didn't drop the phone. The older veteran exhaled a harsh breath, half thank God, half finally, and sat back down like a man who had just handed off a weight he'd been carrying since sunrise. The gallery reacted the way people do when a storm line sweeps across a field, first with awe, then with motion. A woman whispered, "Oh, thank you," to nobody in particular. Someone near the back actually clapped once before catching himself guilty in the hush. The juror who'd watched the floor lifted his eyes, and for the first time that day, his expression had something like heat in it. Cole tried another tack. Judge with respect, Judge Whitmore, still standing, steadied herself on the bench. She didn't reclaim control. She recognized it. "Officer Cole, you will step back," she said, and though the order was quiet, it was unmistakably an order. Cole hesitated one heartbeat too long. An agent matched his position, and the hesitation died. Reed's team moved with the kind of economy that comes from drills nobody enjoys and everybody remembers. One agent spoke to the clerk, another passed a sealed envelope to the prosecutor, who accepted it without quite knowing where to put his hands. A third agent, a woman with her hair pulled tight, spoke low into a lapel mic, and then nodded to Reed as if to say, "The pipe is open, the feed is ready, the chain is intact." And Marcus God. Marcus sat very still as the cuffs came off, like a man resisting the urge to rub circulation back into his wrists, because he refused to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing him grateful for air. When the metal fell away, he didn't stand up too fast. He took one long breath, then another, and only then lifted his eyes to the flag he had glanced at a dozen times already. The look wasn't triumph. It was relief edged with grief, the way a survivor looks at a rescue boat that could have come yesterday and still be right on time. Reed addressed him directly but not loudly. "Mr. Ellison, you're safe. You will remain seated by me." He said it like a fact entered into the record, not a promise that might evaporate when the room calmed down. Marcus nodded once, the soldier in him acknowledging a clear command that finally protected rather than diminished him. The energy rolling through the courtroom didn't vanish the ugliness we'd heard. It outgrew it. You could feel the balance tilt. the same floor that had seemed angled toward a foregone conclusion leveled under our feet. Prejudice had been running the music. Now law changed the song. I heard someone behind me whisper, "They actually came," and someone else answer, "Because she sent it." Elena's eyes shone shock and resolve mingled into one expression. You don't see often relief at being brave in time. Cole lowered his gaze for a beat, shook his head once like a dog clearing water, and put his palms out in a parody of calm. "We'll cooperate, of course," he said, that easy tone back on his tongue. But the room had already learned not to take his voice as the narrator. Reed glanced at the judge. "Your Honor, for the court's awareness, we've received contemporaneous video and corroborating data. Additional agents are securing related evidence off-site. For now, this defendant is not to be removed or restrained. He didn't add by you or by them. He didn't have to." The judge nodded once, a tight, careful motion from a woman catching up to the day. "So ordered." The gavel sounded different this time, less like wood on wood and more like a door closing on what we'd been forced to accept. If you want to know what hope feels like when it returns, it isn't loud. It's the loosened lungs, the shoulders that finally drop, the way people allow themselves to look each other in the eye again. It's the sound of boots that arrive for the right reason. It's a binder thumped on a table, a key turning the correct direction, a sentence that does not end in cuffs. We were not done. Storms don't repair what they sweep clean. They reveal what must be fixed. But for the first time that morning, the room held something sturdier than fear. Evidence had a shape. Authority had changed hands. And Marcus Ellison, no longer a man being dragged to a door, sat beside the federal agent, who had drawn a new line across the tile and said, "Here is where this turns." I didn't know what the binder held until Agent Reed opened it, but the way the room leaned in told me I wasn't the only one bracing. He slid out a slim stack, affidavits, dates, a chain of emails, and placed them where the clerk could see. Then he said the part that rearranged the morning. "Mr. Ellison is not just a veteran," Reed announced, calm as a level line. "He is a cooperating witness in an active federal investigation into corruption and excessive force within this police department." The words landed like a new map thrown on top of the old one. You could feel people trying to make the shapes match. Marcus didn't move. He didn't puff up or shrink back. He sat the way a man sits when something heavy he's been carrying is finally named out loud. Reed kept going, not to grandstand, but to record. Because of the scope and sensitivity, Mr. Ellison was instructed to maintain strict confidentiality. He has done so at considerable personal risk. What occurred here today, he glanced at Cole, then Kruger meets the federal threshold for obstruction of justice. You could almost hear the phrase plug into the room, not just wrong, not just ugly criminal. The agent with the tight ponytail wheeled a small cart forward. On it, a tablet already cued to play. Reed nodded once. The screen bloomed to life with Elena's footage. It was shaky, sure, but the truth doesn't mind a tremor. We heard Cole's bark. We watched the grab the wrench, the quick practice pin. And then the part nobody could unknow, Marcus saying, "I served this country," cut off by the declaration "under arrest," and the cuffs snapping shut. No thrashing, no swing, just a man interrupted, then bound. The gallery stopped breathing. Even the prosecutor leaned forward, elbows on the table, as if proximity might change the facts. The video rolled again, this time with audio isolation. We heard Cole's line, the one that split the day in two. "Men like you. From chains to crime, it's all the same." There was no mistaking it, no courtroom acoustics to blame. It sat there in the speakers like oil on water. Judge Whitmore's hand went to her throat. She looked at the screen, then at Marcus, then at the seal above her. Something inside her gave way, not her authority, but the fiction that had cozied up to it all morning. When she finally spoke, the words came halting, honest in their difficulty. "This court has been compromised." Cole reacted like a man who has relied on momentum his whole career. He stepped forward fast, face flushing, words tripping over each other. "This is outrageous, selective, out of context." He was resisting. "This is my courtroom." Reed didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Officer Cole, place your hands where I can see them." Two agents were already there, one to either side, moving with precision born of repetition. Cole tried to square himself to the judge, to the jury, to anyone who might still be listening to his version. An agent reached for his wrist. The second relieved him of the badge with a clean, practiced lift. The metal left his chest with a tiny click, the kind of sound that can echo in a man's life for years. Kruger went pale. The bravado he wore like a second uniform slid off his face, leaving something younger and startled underneath. "Hey, no, listen," he stammered, palms out. "I didn't. He cold told me." The words piled up and fell apart. The agent nearest him didn't bother to argue. He turned Kruger toward the table, set his hands flat, and read the charge in a tone that refused to be a fight obstruction. Color of law violations under review, custodial assault under review. The room moved in two directions at once, toward sound and toward silence. A woman near the back started to cry, not with sorrow this time, but with a relief that sounded like fatigue being let go. The older veteran closed his eyes and tilted his head toward the ceiling, as if saluting an answer he'd stopped expecting. A juror covered his mouth with his hand. Another gripped the rail knuckles, white as if steadying himself against a wind that had finally shifted. Elena's phone had stopped recording, but she held it like a talisman. When she realized people were looking at her at the small, ordinary device that had cracked the morning open, she pressed it to her heart. She didn't smile. She just breathed, shoulders shaking, once a quiet aftershock. Marcus watched none of the arrests like a man hungry for payback. He watched like someone measuring the cost. When the agent stepped between him and the officers, he let out a breath I hadn't realized he'd been holding. He flexed his fingers, once the faintest test of blood returning, then rested his hands on the table, palms down, steady. Reed addressed the judge again. "Your Honor, pursuant to federal statute, we are securing the integrity of these proceedings. We will submit affidavits and request immediate preservation orders for all relevant records, including internal communications." The prosecutor nodded, chastened by the shape evidence makes when it finally takes up space. He accepted a packet from an agent as though it were warmer than paper should be. Judge Whitmore gathered herself. The voice she found was not dramatic. It was deliberate. "So ordered. This court will recess pending federal review." She looked at Marcus this time, not through him. "Mr. Ellison, you will remain with the agents." It sounded like protection, not removal. Cole, now cuffed, tried for one last angle. "I've served this community," but the words rang thin, stripped of the authority he'd borrowed from a badge no longer on his chest. Kruger didn't try at all. He kept his eyes down, breathing shallow, a man discovering that consequences have weight. And the gallery, us the witnesses, let out the breath we'd been hoarding. It wasn't applause yet. That would come later. It was the sound of shoulders dropping, of fear loosening its grip. For the first time all day, justice didn't feel theoretical. It felt present, walking the room in sensible shoes, speaking in sentences that held. No one could fix the morning in an instant, but the truth had been named, recorded, and set moving. And as the agents guided the officers out, the roles reversed with an efficiency that felt like math. The rest of us understood what had changed. The story belonged to evidence now. And with it, finally, the room. The cuffs came off with a sharp click, and the sound seemed louder than it should have been. Marcus rubbed nothing away. He didn't let his fingers trace the red grooves that burned into his wrists. He simply drew his arms back, rested them at his sides, and rose. And when he rose, it was as though the whole courtroom rose with him. The man who had been dragged in chains now stood tall, shoulders squared, his presence commanding more than any badge or gavel had done that morning. The red marks on his skin were visible, but his eyes were what drew us in. They weren't clouded with defeat anymore. They were bright, steady, fierce, with the kind of dignity that no officer, no accusation, no lie could take away. He stepped toward the bench slowly, every movement deliberate, every footfall heavy with meaning. You could hear the shuffle of papers, stop, the whispers die. Even the air seemed to still, as Marcus raised his gaze to Judge Whitmore. When he spoke, his voice carried, not shouting, not trembling, but resonant, as if the walls themselves had been waiting for it. "I fought for a country that forgot me. But maybe today it remembered." The words did not rush. They came out, measured, each syllable landing where silence had lived. It wasn't just a statement, it was an indictment, a confession and a prayer all rolled into one. For a moment, no one moved. No one even breathed. The jurors froze, hands still. The prosecutor looked down at his notes as though they belonged to someone else. Judge Whitmore sat with her gavel poised, but her eyes, wet lips parted, unable to form the lines she usually leaned on. And then quietly, almost hesitant at first, came the sound of clapping. Just one pair of hands tucked somewhere in the gallery. Then another joined and another. The rhythm built cautious but undeniable until the entire courtroom erupted in applause. It wasn't polite, it wasn't staged, it was raw. It was relief and fury and vindication braided into the pounding echo of palms against palms. A roar of acknowledgement that justice had limped into the room but still found its footing. Marcus did not bow. He did not smile. He simply stood there, eyes steady, letting the sound wash over him as if it belonged not to him, but to every soldier, every silenced man, every person who had ever been dragged unfairly into chains. Special Agent Thomas Reed broke from his line of agents and crossed the floor. He stopped in front of Marcus, and in a gesture that carried more weight than the binder he had slammed down earlier, Reed inclined his head. Not a nod, not a perfunctory courtesy. He bowed just enough for everyone to see. "This nation still owes you, soldier," he said. The words struck like a second gavel, the kind that doesn't end a session but begins a reckoning. Marcus's jaw tightened. His throat worked, but he gave no reply. Sometimes silence is the only answer that honors the weight of what's been said. When the judge recessed the court, no one leapt to their feet. People rose slowly, reverently, as if stepping into a sanctuary after a sermon that had turned their souls inside out. The agents closed around Marcus not as captors, but as guardians forming a ring of protection as he made his way toward the double doors. And as he walked out, we watched not a defendant, but a figure larger than the case itself. A man who had been pushed down, silenced, humiliated, and chained, and who now walked free, head high, each step carving a path that others might follow. Elena Ramirez sat frozen, her phone still in her lap, her face pale with the realization of what her act had sparked. When Marcus passed her row, he glanced at her, not long, not dramatic, but enough for her to know that he had seen her, that he carried her courage with him. She lowered her head, tears falling, but her shoulders lifted as though she too had been released from something heavy. The older veteran who had whispered earlier stood and saluted a sharp motion, despite the tremor in his hand. Marcus returned it, not crisp like in uniform, but steady, heartfelt. Two men bound by service, one battered by the system, the other refusing to let him face it alone. The image lingered, Marcus framed by federal agents, walking out of that courtroom like a soldier returning from a battlefield, scarred, but unbroken. Behind him, the sound of chains no longer clattered. It was replaced by the thunder of applause and the hush of awe. Outside those walls, the story would ripple through headlines, through conversations, through neighborhoods where justice felt like a stranger. His name would become more than a docket entry. It would become a reminder that dignity can survive humiliation, that truth can surface even in rooms built to bury it. And for those of us who sat there pressed into pews in silence all morning, the memory etched deeper, the sight of a man who carried the wounds of both war and prejudice, who whispered despair, and still found a reason to lift his head when it mattered. I left that day with the sound still in my ears, the gavel, the insult, the chains, the applause, a mix of bitterness and brightness, proof that justice doesn't arrive clean. It stumbles, it bleeds, it comes late. But when it comes, it demands to be witnessed. And Marcus Ellison gave us that moment. He turned his pain into something larger than himself, a symbol, a warning, a hope. For him, freedom wasn't given, it was remembered. And for the rest of us watching him step out into the light, the truth burned itself into our bones. Justice may falter, but it can still rise even in the last place you expect it. Justice isn't always loud, but when it finally speaks, it reminds us that dignity, truth, and courage can never be chained. Marcus's story is more than one man's fight. It's a reminder that hope can rise even in the darkest courtroom, and that we all share a duty to stand against injustice. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like the video and share it so others can hear it too. And don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Max Stories for more powerful stories that shine a light on courage and justice. Your support means the world to us. It fuels our passion and gives our team the strength to keep creating meaningful content. Remember this symbol, Mr. Max Stories, where justice finds its voice.